Hey, yo, it's Guido coming at you with a Tactics Talk. Thanks for tuning in. Your support of the channel really helps it go. 9.18 has just dropped about a day ago, and we're going to give a little state of the game here from my perspective. Before we get into 9.18 and the various things that it changes and does, let's talk about an overarching, what I believe were the three big issues for World of Tanks that needed to be sorted out and covered. Number one was Matchmaker. Number two is Arty. And number three is balance. So what did they end up giving us? Matchmaker, Arty, good start, and lights. Okay, lights could be construed as part of balance. Fair enough, it's more content, got it. But really, lights? Okay, so the three things I think are big, Matchmaker, Arty, and balance, let's talk about that in a slight historical perspective for World of Tanks and why they're important. Number one is Matchmaker. Matchmaker has got a lot of hate over the years. Why is that? Because it makes imbalanced teams. It makes people believe that Matchmaker decided the game before it even started, all of that kind of thing. Well, why was that? What are the two things that Matchmaker does that messes up a game or a match? Number one is potentially a tier difference, i.e. I have 5 tier 10s and the other team has 3. And the other one is a class imbalance. Now, of those two, which one is more important, really, when you get right down to it? You would think it's tier, but it's not. Overall, Matchmaker did a pretty good job of sorting out teams, and occasionally you would get a bad tier imbalance where there'd be 6 and 3, but that was extremely rare. What was much more common? Exactly, class imbalance, where you'd have 6 heavies on one side and 3 on the other. Now, sometimes the map would change that, whether it mattered or not. Some maps were medium friendly. Some very few maps, less now than in the past, are TD friendly. However, in the main, the team with less heavies, all else being equal, was at a disadvantage. I think we can all agree to that. But Matchmaker did a pretty good job, actually, covering either the class imbalance or the tier imbalance, with the class imbalance being the worst thing. So what really was the fix to it? Was it a complete revamp of Matchmaker? The 357? Was that it? I don't think so. I think it was a sorting mechanism, and that's not very revolutionary. It's been argued multiple times. The current Matchmaker that they had, or the last Matchmaker that they had, the past Matchmaker, actually just needed tweaking. And in the greatest of wargaming traditions, they took it out with the baby, crap canned it, and let's do something completely different. And we won't regard how maybe this will cascade and react to the rest of the game. So that was a bit crazy to me, and we'll talk about later on how the new Matchmaker 357 and what wasn't actually done to Matchmaker is currently affecting the game. So number two, let's go to Arty. You know what, let's skip Arty, I'll hit that last, let's go to balance, because I know Arty is going to cause an issue. Although we're only talking history right now, so don't get crazy. Balance. About a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago now, the devs came on and made a great big deal. There's a video, a production, a bunch of players got together, they did it in RU, they did it here, about balance. Remember that? About how this last year was the year of balance. After Rubicon failed, by golly, they're going to listen to the players and they're going to balance. And how much have we seen of that? Well, we've seen some nerfs, we've seen some buffs. Okay, that's some balance work, but that's kind of working around the periphery, isn't it? Working around the edges. And in some cases, I would say that you have imbalanced. So maybe we should ask the question when they were saying we're going to work on balance. Did you actually mean you meant to imbalance it more? I don't know. Maybe that was the truth of it. And that's kind of where we are now with the balance thing. Nothing really happened. Well, interesting thing did happen, actually. Now we've got the light tanks and the Arty and the question of how they impact balance. So nothing really done. For my money, what is the biggest issue with balance? The biggest issue with balance, bar none, is gold rounds. Now, stick with me. Don't lose your minds. Don't go crazy about it. Here's the reason. It is a armor to pen balance and hit points to some extent that this game completely revolves around. It's about how much armor you got, whether you can be penned, and hit points can be reduced. It's a hit point reduction game, right, at the core. So that is what everything is revolving around the speed of your tank, the accuracy of the gun, everything else, the hit point damage that you do, the alpha, the DPM, is all revolving around pen and armor. Now you can make armor completely not count, which is more or less where we are right now, or you can make armor too strong, which is where some tanks have gone right now, because things have been done in a vacuum and we've changed specific tanks and not looked at the whole picture, the whole environment. Why does gold rounds affect so much the idea of the balance between armor and pen? Because you have 400 odd tanks, all with separate pen values, and then you add another round into it that adds a separate, wildly different, typically higher pen value. And now you're trying to balance armor to pen off of two wildly different pen values. So do I balance it for the AP round, or do I balance it for the APCR round? Or do I try to hit somewhere in between? As you can see, it's hard enough with the 400 whatever tanks it is that we've got and all the different pen values from regular rounds. But you throw on top of that the gold round, and I'm trying to sort those two out and make a balance. It's no wonder they have a massively hard time figuring that out. I'm not going to get into all the different ways they could sort that. One is just get rid of it. The other one is to reduce. There's so many. Reduce the amount of damage that a gold round does and leave its pen. Slightly reduce the pen. Lots of stuff they can do. But the point is that their balance issue revolves around the gold round. Period dot. Especially since it's been added to everyone's inventory based on you can get it for silver. That's the balance issue and the history of it. All right, Arty, let's talk about that. 8.6, long time ago. Let's go further back. Before 8.6, there were three heavy tanks, right? You had the T-30, which is the American Tier 10, the Maus, and the IS-7. And your Arty went up to Tier 8, and it was relatively accurate. People didn't like it even then, especially good players. The point being that you're being hit from the red line by a guy who has absolutely no danger to himself. That is my contention in a PvP MMO. That's a terrible game mechanic. Nobody's going to like it, especially those being hit by it. It sounds a little bit more like griefing than playing a game. But it was another vehicle. It was a kind of part of war, all that kind of good stuff. So it was in there. And it wasn't quite as bad because it went to Tier 8 and it would shed 300, 400 hit points off of your Tier 10 and maybe a little bit more off of your Tier 9. So we lived with it and on we went. Tier 9, Tier 10 artillery was added, and now we're getting hammered for lots of damage, and it was extremely accurate, and that went on for a while. And there was a time before 8.6 where the entire battle, even more so than right before this last nerf, revolved around Arty, whose Arty was still alive, what the Arty was doing, and how it was hitting the other tanks. The entire game revolved around Arty, and that just couldn't stand. So at 8.6, they nerfed the artillery accuracy. Sort of. And not really if you understand anything about dispersion. But a lot of people stopped playing it. A lot of the arguments about it's not very accurate. And we went on for another several years. And we got to this last week when we got the new Arty nerf, some are calling it, or buff, depending on which side you're sitting on. And we'll talk about that a little while later. But it came to a head once again that Arty bashing, one-shotting, doing all kinds of things to the meta of the game from the red line with no danger to themselves, which is a terrible PvP MMO mechanic. Everybody knows it. Well, what to do? We'll talk about that a little bit later, but really the quandary for wargaming is, and I get it, do we just remove it and then we have to figure out some way to compensate people? Man, that's a morass. What a problem that would be. Do we nerf it into the ground and hope people forget about it and it just kind of never gets played? Well, that's not really good. That's not really good company policy, is it? Or do we try to make something different out of it, which is what they landed on and attempted to do? We'll talk about how that went in just a minute overall. So that's kind of the whole history between Matchmaker, Arty, and Balance. Well, what did we get? We got a Matchmaker change, which didn't really hit the mark. We'll talk about that. We got an Arty change, which absolutely didn't hit the mark. And we got new lights, which I'm a little bit more neutral on. I'm not really sure where that's going to go. I would have to say that before we start talking about it overall, that the lower tier lights are actually kind of buffed. They're a bit better. The higher tier lights, it remains to be seen. So let's get into the Matchmaker Arty and lights change for 9.18. All right, let's talk about the new Matchmaker. So what they have done with the new Matchmaker is they have built a 3-5-7. That will be the standard, which means you have 3 top tier, 5 middle tier, and 7 bottom tier in every battle. So that is the standard by which you will attempt to build. They made provisions for it to be 2 tier or 1 tier. That's so if you're a tier 10 and there's a bunch of tier 10s, you don't have to wait around for a 3-5-7 to show up. You can get into a 2 tier or 1 tier, and that makes sense because the only place a tier 10 can go is the top tier. That is the secondary problem. Remember, I talked about that earlier of tier being the issue. That's the secondary problem. The actual problem then is the class problem. In the past, they would balance lights and Arty, with the limit on Arty added on top of that of 3, although it would go over 3 if they had to based on server population and making a game and not waiting too long. So you would see imbalances of the other 2 classes that aren't included, right? Other 3 in the past, TDs, mediums, and heavies. So they've added TDs to the balance, so now you've got TDs, lights, and Arty, but they still are not balancing on each team the mediums and the heavies. What that means is you can get a large imbalance. The problem, the larger problem with that is that now when you add 3, 5, 7, because the balancing is only across the entire team and not in the tiers, you can get 3 top tier heavies on one side and a Arty, TD, and light on the other. That's terrible. All right, that's just terrible. And it's interesting because they've made an interesting statement about it, and I'll read it over here. We'll look into the option of balancing by all vehicles types, by all vehicles, it does say vehicles types, at a later point. As of now, our main priority is fine-tuning the improved Matchmaker. It's a complex task, and we'd rather take it one step at a time. Concur. What if the first step sucks? Anyway, ensure that the new algorithm runs smoothly and then proceed with refining it further. Interesting that they added TDs. I assume that was because it was easier. The actual issue is the medium-heavy problem. Now, I'm not saying heavies, having more heavies is always going to win the game. You have to take tier into account. That's also part of the problem. I'm not saying having more mediums is going to win the game if you consider we're in a medium meta or a medium-friendly meta, if you want to call it that way. What I'm saying is they've built a Matchmaker that builds imbalanced teams, and then you add on top of that the map. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. I do not understand why they took a half measure. But we've seen it before, haven't we? In any event, that's what we have now, and hopefully they do come to the conclusion that they've got to add the mediums and the heavies into it and take into consideration the tiering and so forth and so on. It seems to me that the old Matchmaker was pretty good, quite honestly. Wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. And it also seems to me that if they simply added a sorting mechanism, they just allowed the old Matchmaker to work as it did. They added a sorting mechanism at the end and said, you know what, this team has 6 heavies and this team has 3. Let's move one. And now we're at 5 and 4. Fair enough. Why was that so hard? Why was that so hard? Now, it didn't address the tier issue, obviously, but I thought that was a secondary issue as far as I'm concerned. So I think there was probably a better way to do it. What we got is what we got. We'll see how it actually pans out. On to the next thing. All right, let's talk about Arty. 1 second, hold on. That requires a drink. Family show, though, family show. Okay, Arty, so what have they done? What have you done? Okay. How many times can I say okay? At least one more time. Larger splash, increased rate of fire, more accurate, less aim time, less damage, less alpha, and stun. And stun. Did they address the actual issue that I talked about, which was what, if you remember? The actual issue with Arty is this is a PvP MMO, and Arty is a game mechanic that allows somebody in complete or near complete safety to influence the battle from the very edge of the board, from the very edge of the game board. That is the issue with Arty. It's not stun. It is not the radius of the blast. It is not whether it does 1 point of hit point of damage or whether it one-shots every tank it touches. It's not whether it has stun. It's not how fast it reloads, how fast it moves, what its camo is, what its vision is. It's none of that crap. That is all the little details about how the game mechanic of damage from the red line from complete safety operates. So once you get past that, that's all details that just don't matter. Because you have damage from the red line from complete. That's bad game design. And everybody knows it. It's unable to be balanced because the premise is that it's able to influence the battle from complete safety. You can't balance that. It doesn't matter if it does 1 hit point or 10,000 hit points. There's no balancing it. Somebody can sit back there and do it in safety. That is bad for game design. So what to do? What to do? I talked about it earlier. I'm not really going to get into it about whether we remove it. What I suggest really is you make it more vulnerable. So, my fix. Make the tracers much more visible. Oh, by the way, the new change, counter Arty is even worse. It's even worse because the splash damage isn't enough to really knock guys out unless you directly hit them. You are more accurate, but because you're shooting at the end of a tracer, you used to rely on splash to kill a lot of those tanks. Now you're kind of splashing them a lot but not killing them. Awful. That is awful. So, tracer's more visible, right? You're probably going to have to increase the damage a little bit, but you need to decrease the blast radius, and you need to, I would, get rid of stun, or at least decrease the time that you are stunned. In addition to that, and this is important, because what we're trying to do here is make it more vulnerable, make it play the game more like the other tanks do. Other tanks move, they can be spotted. If they shoot, if they're getting to an important spot, they can be seen. The Arty needs to join in on that gameplay. They need to be part of the Watt whole, part of the meta. So when they fire, their sector lights up, okay? Either for scouts and other Arty, or potentially just scouts, to include letting scouts see Arty at a further distance than they would see a normal tank as far as spotting goes, to light them for counter battery kind of fire, so that shooting and scooting becomes a part of the game. And lastly, make Arty fire from siege mode. They have to go into siege mode, and then to travel they have to come out of siege mode. In siege mode, while they're firing, there is no direct fire, i.e. a light gets in on them, they don't just spin and shotgun them. If they're in travel mode, then they can spin and shotgun all they want, but there's going to be a long delay between moving in or out of those two. So siege mode can only fire indirect when you're in siege mode, can only fire direct when you're traveling. Long time to set up and tear down. Light up the sector when they fire, either for scouts or for other Arty. That can be debated and looked at. Make the tracers much more visible so counter Arty becomes a player. And then once that actual game mechanic is part of the entire Watt meta, and it fits within much better within how the game is played, Arty players are endangered from the beginning. If they play right, they survive. If they don't, they get killed, like tanks, okay, which is what we're playing. Once you do that, and the game mechanic is better / fixed, then you can start dicking around with damage, rate of fire, dispersion, distance of explosion, yada, yada, yada. That's what you do with Arty. All right, last but not least, we're going to talk about lights. On this one, I'm a little more on the fence, but I do have a couple things to say about it. Number one, I like content. I think content is king, so if you're going to add lights up to tier 10, man, go for it. I think that's not a bad thing. Before I get too crazy about that, though, I did like the idea that scouts had a scout matchmaker. I did like how they only went to 8. They required thought, they required care, they had a specific role. Even though that was diminished in the meta as it was, they had all 3 of those things. It was unique, it was a bit quirky, and to be quite frank, some of the quirky aspects of World of Tanks are what I like about it. That being said, as I mentioned earlier, more content, lights up to tier 10, let's do it, man. However, we've got to keep their uniqueness. They have to have a role. And the question then now is, do they have a role with the way they are as in relation to mediums? And I think the jury's out on that, but in general, it's probably leaning towards not really, not especially at the top tiers. Now, this seems like an overall buff to me for the bottom tier tanks, the few that I have played. I'm talking about 5, 6, 7. There are some real gems in there that work really nicely, and they're probably much better tanks. When you look at things like the premiums with the Type 64, the 1357, the 4190 GF, the premiums that weren't nerfed or moved around, they're probably much better than they were, even though those were all pretty fun and good tanks to begin with. So the jury's a little bit out on that. At the higher tiers, though, I think lights are going to actually find they are struggling a little bit to find their point. And I think a lot of that has to do with the nerf to the view range and how their view range ties in with mediums. The one thing they still have, obviously, is they're generally faster than mediums, not by much in some cases, but generally a little bit more maneuverable, and they still retain their camo. I was going to say ammo. Still retain their camo, I tried to say it again, on the move. And that's important because it allows them to get into certain forward positions of the few bushes that are left and do a little bit of passive scouting and things like that. Stay unspotted a little bit more forward than mediums. So a lot of people want to say mediums can do everything a light can. Well, yes and no. Yes and no. So there are still some niche areas for lights on certain maps, to be sure. So what's the fix to this? I think really probably another rebalance of the vision ranges, maybe dropping back and nerfing mediums and heavies and allowing lights to have their niche in the view range situation. I think that Wargaming is very nervous about things like that because they spent a lot of time killing the vision game years ago. And very good players were able to, we're going to call abuse it, but they understood the rules and they were able to use the vision game really to their advantage. So Wargaming does need to be careful about that as well. Personally, I liked it because I could do well in it, but I understand why they didn't want it to rule the roost. That being said, though, lights have got to have their niche. They need to be light tanks and important, and they need to be scouts. If you go back to what I talked about on Arty and make them important to the counter Arty piece of the game, that would go a long ways towards giving them a niche. Additionally, reworking some of the vision ranges so that lights were the kings of vision. One of the interesting things about this game is when you get to the max spotting range and then you have the max draw range, there's that no man's land in between there. And there's a point at which you can be 1 meter further and thou shalt never be spotted. And there's another point at which you can be 1 meter further and thou shalt never be drawn. And that's an interesting little thing. Good players use that, and a lot of people will say they abuse it. Well, that's understanding the rules. There has to be some kind of rule built in there. There's probably also some issues with the game engine and how the game is designed overall. Whereas if you start moving those things, there's a lot more cascading effects. I understand that, but it would be nice if we drew back some of the vision on some of the heavies and mediums and allowed the lights to have that kind of extra vision. And I think that because they have done such a good job killing the vision control game, that probably wouldn't imbalance the entire game, especially with a lot of the funnel maps that they have. There may still be a few where then lights would rule a roost, but why not? Why not have some unique maps like Proc where a good scout can rule the roost? And even right now, a good scout on some of those maps that are very scout-centric can absolutely carry the day, and that should actually happen. And I hate to say it, maybe there's a map or two where Arty actually rules a roost, but right now we have a situation where lights don't really have a point, do they? Not really. I mean, people like me who like to play lights, I can play them well enough to make them have a point. But overall, for the standard player looking at the stats, looking at how the game is played, the overall meta, they can look at it and go, I don't even know why I would bother with lights other than I have a personal mission or just to say I drove a light. Generally, the medium can do more or less everything it can do, and it's probably less frustrating. So I think if Wargaming would carve out a little bit more of a niche for their lights, this would actually be a pretty good addition to the game. As it stands now, like I said, I'm neutral. I don't think it's really bad or good. It's good because it's more content. It's slightly bad because they don't really have a purpose, do they? Not really. You sort of have to be good enough to force them to have a purpose. They can be little assassin ninjas if you're good. They can be very frustrating, squashed bugs if you're bad. The other part of it that I will talk to then at the very end is the Arty change has really made light tanks' life miserable. I think it's made most tanks' life miserable, but because of the blast distance and the rate of fire, it's pretty easy to splash to death these guys, track them on the move. So whereas it used to be kind of annoying to get hit by Arty in a light, and it did happen, man, now you can barely go anywhere. You add into that some of the channelized maps where you don't really have a lot of maneuver room anyway, and holy cow, it can be absolutely miserable. The other thing I have found out with Arty against lights right now is the shotgun effect. It's brutal because most Arty is much more accurate now and it reloads faster. It is much harder to get in on Arty and kill them. And it was difficult enough right before this patch, especially with auto aim plus, which thank God it's gone. And even now with auto aim, add in the extra accuracy, the rate of fire is faster. You don't have as much time to kill these Arty when you get on them. Man, it is brutal for a light tank trying to kill Arty, which supposedly the light tank is the natural enemy of Arty. That's my 2 cents on that. All right, great. Thanks for tuning in. If you like what you saw, make sure you subscribe. If you now hate me because of my stance on Arty, make sure you unsubscribe. No, I'm just kidding. Please don't do that. Do what you got to do anyway. So we talked about Matchmaker, Arty, and balance as the 3 things that I thought were the major issues that Wargaming had with their game right now. Talked about some of the history, and we talked about how some of those things were addressed, how they maybe weren't addressed enough, and a couple of things weren't even touched. So what did they do? They did Matchmaker, they did Arty, and they added some lights. We talked about the pros and cons of some of those things and how I felt about it. Now this is 2 days, day and a half, 2 days after this thing happened, so I may change my mind. I did go on record when I started that I said Arty will absolutely be worse. I am still holding on to that. I'll retract that slightly and say maybe it's not as bad as I thought it would be, but it's going to take a while to pan out. Right now we're seeing 3 Arty in every game. Everybody wants to see what the new Arty is doing. Even if they're not a fan of it, they're probably loading in with them and just seeing what happens when you play Arty. And the other part of that is if you want to know how to avoid it and what you can do to beat it, then playing it is probably the best way to start doing that. So everyone's sort of trying to feel it out, and we'll see what the meta then rolls into. But right now I don't think it bodes really well for the Arty change. I think it's going to be kind of a miserable experience for everybody involved. That being said, I like the Matchmaker change. I don't think it actually addressed the actual issue, so I think it's going to cause some very serious problems with as far as class imbalances go. Well, again, we'll see how that one pans out. And then lights, great content, awesome. I think probably those tanks are going to need some adjustment. And that is all I got. Again, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you.